So let's get started because we only out a half hour for this. It's intended to be some quick hits over lunch and an open discussion. So I'll get us started. Today we're going to talk about documentation, and that's a big, broad topic. We'll each talk about it from a specific point of view. So we'll do some quick intros and framing of the topic based on the prep that we did. We'll do 4 little 5-minute vignettes by role: IT pro, developer, architect, etc. And then we'll take some Q&A and we'll wrap. We'll have you out in about 30 minutes. So just a quick summary and the approach we're going to take today. For those of you, I think you've all met most of us. We won't belabor the introductions, but I think these labels that Emily laid in here for us are great because they really identify the different roles and the different points of view that we have and that we bring. It
reminds us what we do as well.
Sorry?
It reminds us what we do as well.
Yeah, it helps, right?
Right, because we might forget.
Right. Shovels the walk when it snows, drives the bus to away games, all that good stuff. So a broad array of points of view, and we'll kind of dive in and go by point of view. But these were just some of the considerations that we talked about when we prepared for this. We talked about documentation that you use during the process of a project or a build versus what you leave behind for posterity, right? We talked about design and architectural documentation and what are the attributes that make it good versus not so good. We were sure to talk about audiences. You'll see that in the next slide. There's also a constraint or a consideration around what are we required to do. If you're in an FDA regulated organization, qualification documents for validated systems aren't optional, right? So there's things that are preferential and there's things that are compulsory. We're going to try and underscore that. How do we future-proof documentation when Microsoft is changing the platform on a weekly basis? We're seeing new things in the message center. What review cycles do we add in? What are some best practices about adding review cycles to documentation to keep it fresh and evergreen? And what form factor? I think this was Todd's as an IT pro talking about what makes documentation easiest to consume and to update. So those are some of the considerations that we talked about. I'll kind of flip. I want to get into the meat of this, and I'll use this table to kind of. And this is very, very purple now. I'll use this table just we are on brand.
I feel like I need to drink grape juice right now. I don't know why.
I know.
Why.
Anyone from Welch's on the call? So we'll go in order and we'll kind of let folks introduce themselves and their point of view. So Emily, this was your topic. Why don't you get us started with the BA worldview?
Absolutely. So I think typically when people think of the business systems analyst role and documentation, that you're thinking about what's coming after the process, whether it be training content, some changes to SOPs for any kind of regulatory compliance or other regulations that this business process of your site needs to follow. But what I find is majority of my documentation is actually at the beginning and during the process. So in the beginning, when you're scoping out the work and the requests, documentation is something that I'm commonly using to define the project scope and then also align the stakeholders on an issue. So from a user experience perspective, I might be using something like a journey map to highlight to a larger team what is going wrong in one of our systems to get approval to start working on one of those projects. Very often when I'm working with the different site owners who have raised their hand to say, oh, I need a SharePoint site, we'll talk about their different user stories of who's coming to their site, what they need to accomplish, so what they can achieve later. So I think it's really important to expand that scope of when you're talking about documentation to consider what you're making during the process and make it a little bit more scalable so you can keep it for after the process finishes as well. So if I build a site with the site owner and we documented these different user stories of who's coming to their site and why, if I'm no longer helping that team months from now, that also serves as documentation of what was built and why, so people can pick up where we left off with those different decisions.
Hey, Emily?
Yes.
What percentage of the user guides, et cetera, documentation that you do, are you using repeatable templates that you've developed for yourself or your own toolkit? Like how much is new versus how much is just this is my toolkit that I reuse and recycle?
That's a great question. I would say 70% of it is a toolkit for that business, and then we edit it for the one-off scenarios. But having that consistency across projects also gives all the different site owners consistency in their experience.
Okay.
I think that also speaks to one of the things that was on the earlier slide, Mike, is you always want to make sure you're doing this documentation for the audience who's going to receive it, right? Mm-hmm. You can write all kinds of things, but if no one's going to read it, or if they're not going to read it unless you use a specific format, or there's a template that organization uses that ours doesn't, then that all should be part of the consideration of, what and we'll talk more about this, but what shape does it take? What size does it take?
Mm-hmm. So Emily's documentation a lot of times is, the first contact with the business and translating that into blueprints that the architects and the developers are going to use to build solutions or base that. So let's do that kind of faux handoff from the business analyst. And Mark and Julie, if you would like to talk about the kind of architect role and where some of the documentation, really the most impactful documentation that you see there.
Do you want to start, Mark, or?
No, you go.
I mean, yeah, I can speak to it from the perspective of like architecting the system, right? And I think there's two pieces to this, and maybe let Mark sort of speak to more of the architecting a solution where there's no code versus, or more of a structural architecture document versus the documentation of the architecture of a software solution. So from an integration perspective or building custom solutions or whatever, depending on your audience and who it's deployed to, right? So if you're talking about like a small company with no real developers on staff, what you might develop for an architectural diagram for a software solution, has to be able to be consumed by that audience. So you have to, I think this is going to be a common theme of things we say, is that you have to tailor what you're writing to the audience you are delivering it to, versus if I'm working for a large enterprise and they have development staff or they have technical leadership and can consume a technical architecture diagram, I would maybe be very technical in that. And I think one of the things that I tend to gravitate towards is the picture is worth 1,000 words. And I try not to write too much. I try to make sure that we have very clear pictorial documentation of what the architecture of the solution is and what the different components are, with definitely words around those pictures and what those things are, but trying to keep it brief and concise so that you don't end up having to go back and fix things a lot if minor details of that implementation change, because it's maybe not necessary. So that's how I view architectural documentation, that you develop this sort of pictorial view of it, and then you add enough structure around what those pictures are to sort of paint a clear understanding of what your solution does from a technical standpoint. And then the documentation of the actual implementation sort of comes separately, I think.
So Julie and Mark, any preferred tools for creating those pictures or creating documentation that you use that folks might be interested in?
I just basically use Visio or PowerPoint, depending again on my target audience. So I might personally use Visio and then take a screenshot of that and put it in PowerPoint and then put some words around that, or Word. Again, it's going to depend on who my target audience is and how they want to consume that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. No, we've seen people use tools like Balsamic to do like basic mock-ups or Acture to make comps.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Stefan is on the phone here.
Mm-hmm.
He does a lot of, so when I work with a designer, that's a completely different sort of conversation. And this sort of comes back to the development thing, but you might want to have a style guide. If it's a big enough solution and you have a complete UX that needs to be well understood and meet requirements of other systems you might have or might span multiple systems, you might want a complete style guide. They do those types of things for public-facing websites, and it's similar internally. I think to have a good style guide helps you a lot understand what it is that you're trying to make everything look like, so that there's a consistency there. So, in that case, he's using some of these other tools. Adobe, I think you use a product from Adobe. Any rate, the point being, I don't personally use them because I'm not building things like style guides or user interface diagrams. I'm more putting blocks on pages and giving those blocks names. It's much more simple.
Got it.
I think that their documentation is a giant word that sort of blurs around the edges, right? Sometimes we're documenting things so that we can communicate better in the course of doing some work. Like, this is what we're all agreeing to do. So let's read this together and say, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And then sometimes it's, once I'm done, here's what I'm going to leave behind so that people can either more effectively use it or understand how to fix it or support it or whatever. So, documentation, like I said, it's a big word. And lots of times when, Julie, you had alluded to this earlier, lots of times when we're building something that is not a coded solution, we don't do like an architectural design or architectural design up front. We sort of sketch it out, like these are the bullets of the thing that we're going to do. And then because we iterate a lot during the course of building the thing, we're not necessarily writing a lot down. We may be talking in teams, we may be sending emails back and forth. And then once it's done, we're writing up, okay, this is how it works, and this is how you use it for people so that the thing has longevity. So again, as you said, Julie, it sort of depends on what is the thing that you're building and how like massive is it? How what tools are you using to actually build it? Sometimes documentation becomes a part of that build, and other times
I think it's also, to your point though, that's also important. Like if we're doing Office 365, Microsoft 365 solutions, and there's a lot of low code pieces to a solution, that's where I think it's really important to have a visual model and some this is the step, this is the flow that stuff goes through if there's sort of a state machine there.
Right.
So Mark, if you're looking at something like a Power App though, you do want to do that level of documentation just as if Julie or I or you would do for like a data model. In some instances, you're building that data model. It just isn't in a SQL database. So there is, I would argue that you do need to plan those things up front just because they're malleable. You don't want to necessarily be recreating tables or recreating names because you may be able to change the display name, but not the internal name. And, then you've got something called, products, but the field is called items underneath. So I think
not that we've ever
that
had
is
that exact instance.
Exactly.
My data structures are self-documenting. I don't know what you're talking about.
And it comes also back to that point where, it depends on who you're working with and what it is that's going to be useful for them. If you're working with people who data model does not mean anything to them at all, then writing that down is useful for you as a practitioner, but it's not necessarily useful to deliver to somebody. It's not a bad idea to have that piece of documentation as part of your general scope of work, but you have to have somebody who's able to read it and interested in reading it. Otherwise, you're writing something down for the sake of writing it down.
Mark,
until you need to edit it
you need it
6 months.
Yeah.
And a lot of documentation is written for future you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not just for other people, it's often for yourself.
That's a great point that we didn't really talk about in the audience, that sometimes the audience is future you. That's a really good point. Mark, are there any distinctions around documentation for the support scenario? Like if you're writing things for developers who are building something versus level 2 and level 3 support who's going to be escalating issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things you want to make sure that you think through is sort of the FAQ level, right? So, there's how does it work? And then what are the things that people struggle with the most? And you expect them to either have questions, hopefully there's no struggling, but expect them to have some questions about, or some variations that the support people might see. So So, most help desks or support people will have that kind of, they'll build that kind of knowledge base over time. But if you can prime that pump,
yeah,
and, as we were rolling this out, these are the sets of questions that people asked us, and these were the answers for them. Then they're getting a kit to start supporting the thing up front, which is much better than just, oh, by the way, we launched this thing, have at it.
And usually the architect knows where in the design the weak spots are that are going to need a little bit more love, a little more help, a little more documentation. Like
Sure.
we're building navigation that lets you pin, follow, and there's one other thing due to sites, right?
Yeah, sometimes we intentionally will cut a corner. We'll say, well, we can automate this piece, but that's going to happen 3 times a year. So here's the 3-pager that says what you do instead of us automating it.
Exactly.
So that piece of documentation becomes really important, and somebody's got to hold that, whether it's the support people or the person you built it for or whoever. And you got to make sure that it's written for that audience and is in the right place.
Okay. Can we toggle to Todd and talk a little bit about the IT pros view of documentation?
I think we can. So for me, when we were talking about this, and Mike said it, and it's one of these things that I remind myself of all the time. You have to know your audience. You just have to. And we did the pre-discussion for this on Monday, and a lot of our spirited debates really came down to who the audience is. And that's just the thing you have to keep in focus the entire time. From the IT perspective, for me, there's kind of 2 types of documentation. And again, I'm assuming, knowing some of the people that are in the chat room and all that, we're all Office 365 folks. So part of that documentation is how things are laid out. And that can be, Mark and I had a customer call this morning. We were kind of talking about some architecture things, and we were discussing whether they should use folders or document libraries or sites or subwebs to scale. The documentation should talk about which way we decided to scale and how, why and how we're doing that. One of the things I like to do after the fact is there's a lot of different ways to document how things are created so that future sites or whatever can be created the same way. That can be done a couple of different ways. Our folks at SysKit here have a tool, SysKit Trace, that does that you can run it and it gives you a report that you can look back on that documents everything. If you use site scripts or site designs to create things, like Mike joked earlier, my code documents itself. Well, that's kind of how that works. If you're using PowerShell to do things, that PowerShell kind of is a document to what you're doing. One of the things, and that kind of brings me to my other part, is I write a lot of PowerShell as an IT pro, that whole DevOps thing, whatever that means. And I just document the snot out of my PowerShell code. I remember one time very specifically with Derek, we had a customer thing and I handed some code off, and I'm a terrible coder. I'm embarrassed of my PowerShell. And so I just document everything because I assume I'm doing something wrong. And if I say in English what I'm trying to do, the next person will be smarter than me and they'll be able to do it better. And so Derek's first comment was, I love reading your PowerShell because every line was commented. For that code and for that audience, that was exactly correct. But then Julie, who does more thoughtful, deliberate programming, she's like, that's horrible. Don't ever do that. She was getting the rolled up newspaper to hit me on the nose with it. And if I wasn't,
luckily you're far away. I can't.
If I wasn't 1,500 miles away, but again, it's all about audience. And so when I write my PowerShell, my audience is one of 2 people. It's either myself in the future, and hopefully when I look at it in the future, I've learned more and I can go back and do the same thing, but do it better. I do that all the time. And the other thing, one of my favorite phrases is always document your code as if the next person to read it might be a homicidal maniac who knows where you live. So that's the other audience I write my comments for, my documentation.
Okay.
But it's that whole thing, a lot of times, one of the great things about working at Sympraxis is we all do the same thing, but we all do it very differently. And so we all have our areas of expertise, but there have been multiple times when I have had an issue that I just couldn't figure out. And I've explained it to Julie or explained it to Mark, and they'll be like, I have no idea about this part. That's your area. And I'm like, I get that, but I just need to say it out loud. I need to work through it in my head with an audience. And I find commenting my code and commenting the way things are set up is that a similar exercise. It makes me understand what I'm doing better, and I will catch things that I'm doing poorly when I have to document it. So that's kind of how I see documentation. Like everybody else, I don't like it, but boy, when it's there, I love it. I hate doing it, but I love finding it and using it.
Todd, any best practices for creating run books?
Again, that's kind of the whole site design and all of that. So I comment the snot out of them. I use the pound sign very liberally, and just every line of code that I put in, I try to put an explanation to myself or to the aforementioned homicidal maniac what I'm trying to accomplish with that, so that somebody can come by later and try to make heads or tails of it.
And future me and a homicidal maniac who know where you live could be the same person. Actually.
Yeah, it's not me.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I always know where I live.
So in other words, Todd will just hit himself.
That's right.
That would be
That's
perfect.
right. Yeah. Just call a penalty on yourself.
Sometimes
So developers, let's hear from you. Let's hear from Derek and Julie a little bit about some good practices about documenting your code.
So I will say the one thing, not necessarily a good practice, but I will say the one thing I hate more than anything is when I get handed code and then a 50-page Word document that outlines the code. And I think that sort of speaks to sort of how you joke about self-documentation, but in reality, your variables should be properly named. Your functions should be properly named. And, we may differ on this, but I would say, all of your functions should be named properly and have a description of the inputs and the outputs, or the name should be, matched properly, so that all you really need to do is look at it. The other part is breaking down that functionality in your functions so that they're not super complicated, so that the name actually reflects, I'm going to have a function called get items. And guess what that function's supposed to do? It's supposed to get items. It shouldn't get items, then go do some processing on them. You should break it out into two functions. So that's sort of like, from a self-documentation point, that's really where I try to stand, and not write tomes that you slam on the desk and expect some developer to read, because we're not going to read it. I don't.
Yeah.
So you nailed the what does that function do, Derek? And I think that's the smart naming conventions and annotations in the code. But is there ever a case for why did you do it that way? Like, we had an option to do things two different ways and we chose to do it this way?
That, I would say, should be in the architectural design documents.
Okay.
Because if you're making, unless it's a very, very granular change, I would argue that that's the kind of thing that you have to think about as an architect and say, I'm electing to store this content in this spot or do it this way. And that affects how you do things throughout the entire application. Julie, do you?
Yep. We're totally on the same page as usual. I'm going to add a couple of small points in that. Coding ego has no place in code for the general public or for business consumption. There's a subset of developers who try to write the most cutting edge, most elegant, tiniest code that possibly can be written. And if it becomes so elegant that it's unreadable, then you've got a problem, because nobody can go. If somebody comes back and you're using very obscure functionality in a particular coding language, those things just cause confusion, and now your code is not self-documenting, and now you really need to add a comment. So you went through all that effort to do some crazy bit of coding that makes that thing that should be 3 or 4 lines 1 line, but now you've got to put a comment on top of that, because nobody's going to be able to figure that out, what that's doing. So that's definitely a little whatever.
The too smart by half.
I remember.
Yeah.
In the old days, you'd have people who try to write a C program, not C#, a C program in 1 line, right?
Yeah.
Because you can use pointers for everything, and look how elegant this is, and be like, yeah, but I have no idea what this does.
Yeah.
So, there's definitely a balance there. Sometimes using 3 lines of code instead of 1 is a better idea.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to also add to the breaking out in functions, one other little bit there. I have one of my huge pet peeves is when you have 1 function per file. A lot of coders will put more files with less in them And so when you're trying to read and understand how code works, like to Derek's earlier argument of, get items. Okay, get items is in this file, but process items is in another file in another folder, like, halfway up the rest of the code because of the way the sorting works. And so now I've got to jump from file to file to file to try to figure out what that thing is. You got to be thoughtful of how you architect your code. What are your containers look like? What goes in each of those containers? Are you going to organize by function? Are you going to organize by, service? How are you going to lay out your code so people can consume it? And you know what? Gosh darn it, if the functionality of that piece of code needs to change significantly, then reorder it and organize it better and move things around so that it makes sense to somebody. That's my only other.
Totally agree.
Sometimes refactoring means reorganizing things in folders.
It might mean.
It might.
Yeah. And no kittens will die.
Always kittens.
So can I, as we take it to the next slide, and we're getting close to the top of the hour, I think one of the things, and I didn't put in a project manager line item in here, but we touched on it earlier, and one of the things I'd recommend the most about writing documentation is if someone else has written it for you, don't write it. So Microsoft and learning pathways, there's documentation that's out there that is going to be kept more updated than you have the resources to do. And Mark, this is also a segue into the open source or the community documentation that I know you've had a lot to do with. So I had that down in our resources and takeaways on this slide, the community docs for Microsoft 365. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Mark, for folks?
Yeah, I mean, so the Microsoft 365 community content it's been around for about a year, but it's sort of a new thing. And the idea is that as a community, we learn how to do things. We figure out some cool solution. We, realize that if we add these three things together, we come up with something that adds up to more than three. And lots of times we'll write a blog post, and so our audience is reasonably good if our blog is well known. But if not, there needs to be a place for all that sort of community-driven content to go, and that's what the Microsoft 365 community content's all about. So sometimes your documentation might be a list of links to, here's how you create a content type. Here's how you set security up. Here's how you do whatever. And those documents could be in that community repo, which is not written by Microsoft. It could be stuff that is written by Microsoft because they write very good documentation at the level that makes sense for them as a business to support their products. But there are different sources, and I think it's important for you to know what those sources are and how to glue them together as part of your documentation base, so that you can serve all the needs that we've been talking through.
So we encourage everyone to look at this, to use it, and to contribute to it, right? This is by, of, and for the community.
Yeah, it's open source. So, usually that means that a smaller group of people does a lot of work and a larger group of people read or consume, and that's totally fine. But if you have ideas, we're also very interested in people's ideas. I've looked for documentation on X and I can't find it. That's a perfect example.
Great. So before we talk, and I'll leave this on screen to talk about our next topic, ways that folks who've joined us can submit questions or ideas for future topics. I'll leave the resources and takeaways, some of our upcoming speaking gigs, but also I want to open it up. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but folks, if you've got specific questions that we can tackle here, open up your mic and let's hear it. I think this is designed to be as interactive as possible. So we try to bring some content with us, but really this is about you and getting your questions answered. Any questions from anyone on the call? Shelley,
shy people.
Shelley, I know you're not shy. Come on.
I have a question. This is Andrea. First of all, my chat shows is not working. I'm sure technically that may be right, but it says only team members can chat. I asked the team owner to make you a member. So I don't know how that figures into the type of meeting, but that's what it says.
Okay.
We'll look into that.
Okay. My question is, more in terms of like for the PM side and the business analyst side, do you do you find that you ever use like videos as documentation? I realize you're not going to do that for code and stuff, but for other things, do you find that that's a better method or easier, or mostly written documentation?
Emily, I've got strong opinions, but I know you do too. Why don't you start if you want?
I do too.
Okay,
Sure.
cool. Yeah.
I think accessibility is something that's important to consider if you are going to use videos. So if you are going to make them, I'd recommend keeping them short, about tiny, sizable chunks, like under 3 minutes. Upload them in stream so they get those automatic closed captionings. Some people don't necessarily like to learn that way. And often when I'm Googling, I personally hate a video because I like to see the steps and do it side by side with what I'm working on. So I think it's nice to have some bullet points as well, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. But I do think videos can be really impactful for different styles of learning and catching different audiences.
Yeah, we have a portfolio of options, right? Video is one, Word documents are another, conversations are part of that portfolio too. Just spending some time in a room talking about how something works is actually a way to document what you've done.
Sure.
So we need to think about, which of these mechanisms is the best one to try and help the person, again, who's the audience, what do they need in order to be successful, help the receiver of the documentation be able to be in the best shape possible.
Yeah, my input on that, and this is from a guy who's got a YouTube channel and nearly 500 podcasts. I do a lot of video. I find video to be a great augmentation to documentation, but I can tell you the amount of times that I have shouted profanities because I have Googled something and found a link that was the thing that I wanted, instead of it being an article that I could scan in 30 seconds and pull the step out that I'm missing. Instead, it's an 8-minute video that I have to watch. That infuriates me. And I can tell you, I came across that by accident. I was doing my podcast, and one of my friends who also podcasts asked me if I paid to have it transcribed. And I said, no, that, who would do that? That's worthless. And he's like, have you ever looked something up on the web and found the only answer was a video? And I'm like, oh, I hate when that, son of a.
So Todd, the question is, to what degree does automated transcription change that game?
So I've played with it a little bit, and I have not. So my buddy Matt was right. He nailed it. But for me, for my audience, for my podcast, I've not had anybody ever ask for it. So I've ran through the automated transcription stuff. So like Emily said, if you put it up on stream, it gets closed captions. YouTube does that. Camtasia will do that. It's always been a little off, so it's always been more work than I've wanted to go through to go back and check all that, especially with all the product names and stuff that I talk about.
All right.
But if you're doing some wholesale stuff, it might be worth it. The other thing that's kind of weird is I know a lot of podcasters use like virtual assistants. So folks and others that will work for fewer dollars. And like Andrew Connell and Chris Johnson, that's what they do. They've got somebody somewhere in some corner of the world. They ship them off, and that person does the transcriptions for them. And so that might be an option too if you're doing a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
Other shameless plug for Microsoft Stream is that transcript is searchable. So you search for that exact step, which is a big.
That's where I was going, right? The automated transcription and the searchability of that changes the game, because now you can skim a video.
Yep.
That's why I don't do a lot of video, for the same reason you said. It's hard to skim. So, Andrea, I hope that helps. I know we're in bonus time here. I do want to make sure 2 weeks from now, managing your work across multiple tenants, some of the things we've learned about profiles in our browsers and pointing our Microsoft Office applications to different tenants. We all do it all the time. We think people do it in the field as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So down the bottom, I got tomorrow night, multilingual. Emily and Todd are presenting Friday on what used to be SharePoint Saturday. Now it's Office 365 Friday. Nominally Nashville, but available online for everybody. So Emily flexing her OneNote muscles and Todd on site designs. So tune in if you're able, if you're interested. As always, reach out to us directly if there's follow-up questions, and submit them to the address that you see on the screen. Because I suspect there were more good questions bubbling up out there that we didn't see in the chat.
Well, I think they can't chat. I think Teams won't let guests come in depending on how they.
We'll figure out another mechanism. Yeah, we'll figure out a different mechanism to do that.
Yeah.
Get more dialogue.
Mike
This
and
is very
Shelley.
helpful. Thank you.
Hey, Shelley. Thanks, Andrea. Hey,
Yep,
Shelley.
Thank you for the session. I did want to make one little comment about learning pathways. Voice from the trenches. We're finding it a little challenging because of the, a lot of that content is really great, except for we might not want our users to do some of those activities. And so the editing piece of it then becomes a problem because we can't really change the Microsoft content to tailor it to say, oh, you know what, we're going to just downplay this function, which leads us to create our own separate page cannibalizing a lot of the information, but then having to tailor it out. So I know that Learning Pathways is still very much in the early stages of its maturity, but that and also then trying to point directly to the pages rather than through the playlist, it's all very heavily Microsoft branded. And we've gotten some blowback as far as, no, we don't want to see those skins. We want to just see the content. So we don't want to adopt those pieces of information. So just a little feedback on that. I know you guys are working on it. I know that Julie's been a real mainstay in trying to move that project forward, and really appreciate all the work that you're doing on it.
Cool.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks for joining. And
Thanks.
we'll give you the Microsoft. That's good feedback. Thank you. Sorry, everybody drink.
Where's that newspaper?
No, thanks for joining, everybody. We appreciate it. We will we'll speak to you in 2 weeks, if not sooner. Feel free to reach out to us about any of this, and we look forward to the next Ask Sympraxis. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.